How pirates fought on land. Most pirates throughout the Golden Age earned their hardtack from capturing ships by sea, but there was a time when they were so numerous and powerful that they were able to attack by land and plunder entire cities. In this video we will explore the tactics and strategies that enabled them to do so. But the pirates that sacked cities weren't just any pirates. They were the Buccaneers. What made the Buccaneers stand out from other military forces were their tactics. Conventional armies of the time fought in an organized and predictable fashion. The campaigns took place on a continuous landmass like Britain or Germany. Most engagements were lengthy sieges, raids or skirmishes. Actual battles were optimally fought on a flat terrain, with rows of musketeers supported by pikemen, cavalry on the flanks, and a back row of artillery. Buccaneers battled in an irregular fashion, eerily reminiscent of modern infantry tactics. They fought in loose formations, used smoke for cover and suppressive fire. But these methods didn't just pop out of nowhere. For one, this irregular way of fighting was perfect for the Caribbean. Any large landmass, like the Spanish Main, was full of hostile jungles between cities, preventing large-scale movement of armies. Rather, a small force could launch lightning raids with boats, or move quickly through the terrain. However, this type of irregular fighting required discipline, experience, and individual fighting prowess, all of which the Buccaneers had in spades. To understand where this came from, we need to understand where the Buccaneers came from, starting out with the originals. They were French hunters fighting a guerrilla war against the Spanish on Tortuga and Hispaniola. The hunters, called buccaneers, lacked possessions and families, but were armed with state-of-the-art muskets and plenty of ammunition, making them perfect guerrilla fighters. The second wave of buccaneers were originally English soldiers. They had been sent to invade Hispaniola in 1655 as part of Oliver Cromwell's Western design. The operation ended in disaster and they conquered Jamaica instead. On Jamaica, they quickly had to abandon conventional warfare when the Spaniards took to the hills and forests and resisted them with guerrilla warfare. The English adapted, learned the tactics of their enemy, and perfected it against them. So these two groups formed the original bulk of the Buccaneers. French hunters that had fought a guerrilla war in Hispaniola, and English veteran soldiers that had learned guerrilla tactics from fighting the Spanish rebels on Jamaica. These groups were likewise augmented by sailors, pirates, and veterans from other conflicts like the 30 Years' War in Europe. As the century went on, they would pass on their tactics and methods to new recruits. The Buccaneer way of warfare required good organization. When attacking a city, their force could count as many as 1,000 men or more. Even just 300 men were hard to control. These Buccaneer forces came about in two ways. Either a famous and powerful military commander would seek to augment his force with smaller Buccaneer companies for a campaign. Take Henry Morgan, for example, traveling to Tortuga to recruit additional French flibustiers to join his expedition to Panama. The other way was for several companies to band together. The captains would gather in general consultation and elect their most able man to be their commander. During the land campaign, his title was general. During battle on land, the force would be divided into the individual companies, each one led by its captain. Being a Buccaneer commander was a dangerous job, as you were expected to lead from the front, take the charge and motivate the men. Many Buccaneer commanders died or were wounded on the front lines. Each company would fly its own banner to distinguish friend from foe and to give a sense of identity for the men to rally beneath. These flags were plain colors like red or green, striped colors, and might even include a device like an arm wielding a sword. In 1688, a group of French buccaneers fighting on land in Mexico used a red banner with a skull and crossbones, the first recorded incident of Christian sea rovers ever using that symbol. As far as we know, these banners were never used at sea, only during land battles. Confidence is likewise key to military discipline, and the buccaneers had legendary morale. Every man was there on his own accord and could leave whenever he wanted. Ability was awarded and assignments were given based on individual merit. This seems to originate from the Buccaneers' military tradition as well. As explained, many of the original Buccaneers were veteran soldiers from Oliver Cromwell's New Model Army, which functioned on a meritocratic basis. The Buccaneers had to perform their best, because if they didn't win, they wouldn't get paid. Rather than earning a set wage, they were paid in a share of the plunder from looted cities. They were also compensated for injuries by a larger share, meaning that the Buccaneers were more willing to take risks. And if you died in battle as a Buccaneer, your payment would be given to your closest relatives. The Buccaneers' excellent equipment also contributed to their strong esprit de corps. Conventional armies were stuck with the matchlock, whilst the Buccaneers widely adopted the superior flintlock through private purchases. Superior firepower was the favored tactic of the Buccaneers, and they named the musket their arm, but more on that in a section about tactics. That explains the origins of the Buccaneers and how they were able to become a fighting force that could take on cities. But it doesn't explain why. Well, cities had more riches, simple as that. If your company numbers in the hundreds, it isn't profitable to just prey on enemy shipping. Neither were their sailboats strong enough to engage the heavily armed treasure fleets. They could fight on land, so why shouldn't they? But before we get into the strategies and tactics of the Buccaneers, we have to unravel the quality of their enemies and the biggest reason the Buccaneers were able to win: the Spanish. In movies, we often see Spanish soldiers as being native to the Iberian Peninsula, but only a third or less of Spain's American population was ethnically European. Most of the farmers, workers and soldiers were Indians, Africans and mixed races. The best colonial soldiers were Mediterranean mercenaries known as Greeks, usually because they were Greek Orthodox and originated from the Levant. Some did, however, argue that the Basques, known as Biscayers, were better. This pool of vastly different men formed the backbone of Spain's colonial defenses. Locally raised militias were nothing to brag about. They were given poor training, if any, and equipped with low-quality matchlock firearms, arquebuses, carbines and hunting pieces. Spain had strict gun regulations, and civilians were prohibited from privately purchasing weapons to defend themselves from the frequent pirate incursions. Oftentimes they were armed with only spears. As you might imagine, their morale was poor. They weren't veterans of bloody battles, but merchants, planters and laborers, even slaves. And was it really worth dying in battle against the pirates? They were only there to rob them, not conquer or genocide. However, if their personal property was threatened, you could expect the Spaniards to put up a ferocious fight. One farmer was able to defend his farm from 3 buccaneers with only a pike. The militias were backed up by professional soldiers armed with good quality matchlock muskets. Many of those soldiers were valiant military men, as Governor Guzman of Panama called them. A few of them were able to fight effective guerrilla warfare, like those who resisted the English conquest of Jamaica, but this doesn't seem to have been a widespread phenomenon in the Caribbean. On occasion, they were likewise supported by artillery, which the Buccaneers lacked. Equipment also varied from region to region. Uniforms were not worn by Spanish colonial troops until the early 18th century, but troops could be distinguished by red sashes and red feathers in their hats. We often see Spaniards wearing conquistador armor, but this had been abandoned in most of the Caribbean, since breastplates can take a bullet. However, in the Spanish Main, the Spanish frequently fought against Indians armed with bows and arrows, facilitating the need for armor that could deflect it. Here you'd find Spaniards armed with iron helmets, breastplates made from leather or plate, and maybe even cotton gambeson adapted from the Mayans. Spain's greatest military asset against Buccaneers was its cavalry. Most commonly, they were the lanceros and the dragoons. Lanceros were poorly equipped cavalrymen armed with swords, shields and lances. What they lacked in equipment they made up for in skill. They frequently fought in bullfights and often hunted wild cattle from horseback, a very dangerous practice. These hunters were often called matadors, cow killers. Dragoons were well trained and a dangerous sight to any buccaneer. They were armed with swords, flintlock pistols and carbines. They were fortunately a rare sight. The Spanish leadership should not be understated either. They were fierce and proud gentlemen, well dressed and religious. At Portobello, Morgan fought a Spanish commander who refused to surrender and fought on until he was killed. In the South Seas, a Spanish general leapt into the water to save his own crew from drowning. The Spanish were famously religious, and one commander said that those who charged into battle against pirates would be rewarded in heaven. Chaplains were commonly found preaching to the soldiers before battle. Now that we have covered both the Buccaneers and Spaniards, we can't forget the often forgotten wildcard, natives. Various native tribes in the Caribbean either supported the Spaniards or pirates. When supporting the Spaniards, they were subjected peoples that lived under Spanish rule and fought as auxiliaries. They were Christian and bore Spanish names, but often retained many of their cultural customs and definitely their way of fighting, which we'll discuss shortly. If they supported the pirates, they were independent tribes called Wild Indians or Bravos by the Spanish, likely where the word braves originates from. Natives were a great ally to pirates. They hated the Spaniards for invading their land, kidnapping their women and converting them. They knew the terrain and various rivers and made excellent canoes. They could likewise support the pirates with fruits like plantains, bananas, peppers and sugarcane, even alcohol made from maize or fruits. They were also excellent hunters and fishers. I mentioned before that the Spaniards used armor to counter the bows and arrows used by Indians. The bow and arrow was indeed their favorite weapon. It was inferior to the musket in terms of accuracy, range and damage, but had two qualities invaluable to the Spanish stratagem. It didn't smell and it didn't glow. Can you guess why? I'll explain it later down the video when we talk more about battles. The natives also used spears, tomahawks, machetes, and might also apply poisons, typically to their arrowheads. Now that we have explained the various forces involved in the Buccaneers' battles, let's look at their actual strategies and operations. The smallest type of attack was called a descent. This was a simple attack where a small force landed on a beach or in an unarmed village with the objective to acquire provisions or intelligence. They would capture pilots to help them navigate the waters, or local guides that knew the terrain. William Dampier, for example, once captured a Mexican woman and gave her children to use as guides. When they were done, they let her go harmless and even gave some clothes for the family. While sea rovers of the late Golden Age couldn't attack cities and military installations, they continued making descents. For example, after escaping Nassau in 1719, Charles Vane and his pirates landed on the island of Eleuthera to plunder liquor and livestock. Plantations also became lucrative targets, since they were often located close to the sea and lacked fortifications. Some privateers would recruit the plantation slaves for their plundering efforts, promising them their freedom and payment in return. Descents were small attacks, and now we move on to the early stages of a buccaneer's land campaign. Their large-scale strategies and preliminary steps to taking a city. First, let's talk about their boats. Buccaneers favored the usage of small sailboats like sloops and brigantines. Henry Morgan's fleet primarily consisted of open boats like piraguas and barks. When approaching land, they had to anchor their larger vessels and conceal them. Smaller vessels might navigate through rivers or could be beached. If the buccaneers intended to leave their boats permanently, such as during a crossing of a lengthy landmass, they would drill holes to prevent the enemy from using them. Sometimes the goal of a landing was to set up a supply base to stage future attacks from. A few buccaneers captured the island of Old Providence, from whence they launched attacks on the main. Morgan used Old Providence to claim the castle of Chagres, a fortified outpost located near Panama, which he used as a supply base to attack Panama City from. When setting up a camp, the buccaneers would pitch tents from sailcloth or construct huts or even crude houses, with local materials like reeds, bamboo, and palm leaves for roof. In these houses they would store supplies and treat their wounded. Good shelter was vital to keep their powder dry from rain and moisture. Indeed, moisture was one of the most dangerous hazards to campaigning buccaneers, since they were so reliant on their guns. A well-trained group of only 50 pikes and swords could easily have demolished a much larger troop of buccaneers with useless powder. Buccaneers traveled inland in two ways. Either they traveled up rivers in piraguas or canoes. If they couldn't travel upriver, they would go on foot. It was vital to maintain discipline during the march. Individual buccaneers might split away from the company to rest or rob smaller targets. Desertion was threatened with murder, but that was really just a scare tactic, and the buccaneers lacked the hearts to kill their own. So why were they so petty about sticking together? A deserter could be captured by the enemy and made to reveal the buccaneers' plans and positions, allowing the enemy to prepare defense. Maintaining secrecy was key. Enemy scouts and civilians were captured, and the commanders might not even reveal the plans to their own men until the last moment. During the march, they used slaves to carry their packs. The buccaneers traveled lightly for the sake of speed, and would bring few provisions with them, maybe just a few cakes of bread per man. Sometimes they didn't bring any food with them, and would rely on foraging instead by hunting, fishing, and stealing food from farms and villages. To counter buccaneer foraging, Spaniards would empty their food stores ahead of the incoming force. Cattle, sheep, and llamas would be killed and left to rot. Sometimes they released dogs that would kill wild animals like goats or pigs, preventing the pirates from hunting. Even an empty stomach would not stop a buccaneer. They would roast and eat the leather from sacks, shoes, and purses. Far from appetizing, but it would go down well enough with some generous gulps of water. Water was found in the rivers they traveled and could be kept in clay jars and leather calabashes for reliable preservation. But even the buccaneers needed their sleep. They would sleep under large trees, pitch tents, or build bivouacs. They may or may not light a fire in fear of revealing their position. Around the fire they would maintain their weapons, make bullets, and choose their forlorn. The forlorn hope, or lost children, were the buccaneers' vanguard. They marched in front and were expected to scout ahead, engage advance parties of the enemy, capture prisoners, and take the brunt of ambuscades. In battle they led the charge. Every morning they were rotated, and the members were selected by the throw of a dice. They might also consist of volunteers. Marching buccaneers were always under the threat of ambushes, which they called ambuscades. This was the Spaniards' favorite way of fighting. They cut down trees to create roadblocks and dug breastworks along major routes where they positioned their shooters, sometimes even artillery. However, the buccaneers were often able to discover the ambuscades. The Spaniards used matchlock muskets that could be smelled from afar and be seen glowing at night. This is why the bow and arrow used by native auxiliaries were so good for Spanish tactics. You couldn't discover them until the arrows started raining from the sky. At close range, the Spaniards charged, screaming with their pikes, swords, and shields. If buccaneers discovered an ambuscade, they would either engage it from afar using skirmishing tactics, or they would just walk around it. They could likewise avoid them by taking unpredictable routes. The deadliest type of ambuscade were those staged by cavalry. They could charge in swiftly and retreat as quick as they had come. In 1683, a group of around 50 buccaneers were cornered in Mexico by Spanish dragoons and massacred. Amongst them was the navigator and author Basil Ringrose, one of my favorite sources from the period. It was preferable to take cities entirely by stealth. The buccaneers would arrive near their target at night and spent the night landing troops on a nearby shore. When dawn rose, they marched on the city and took it by surprise. By attacking during religious festivals, the Spaniards would be even more relaxed and off guard. Capitan Loail was able to take the city of Santiago entirely by surprise when he attacked the morning before Easter and was even able to capture the governor in his bed. The buccaneers could also attack targets that were far away from locations typically threatened by pirates. Henry Morgan's first success was a raid on the city of Granada, located many miles from the Caribbean Sea, on the shore of Lake Nicaragua. He was able to take the city entirely by surprise, without losing a single man, and captured every resident in the process. These stealth attacks were preferred since they prevented the enemy from mustering a defense or from evacuating the city. If the city was evacuated, the civilians would flee with their valuables and would warn nearby colonies, potentially bringing reinforcements to fight the pirates. Before battle began, buccaneers would eat and drink heartily. Their commander might hold a speech and every man would shake hands before marching on the enemy. This is where we can finally take the buccaneers' experiences, equipment, leadership, and combine it into their innovative battlefield tactics. A conventional army of the 1600s fought in rigid formations, with lines of musketeers supported by pikemen, cavalry on the flanks, and artillery in the back rows. The buccaneers had only musketeers, and their favorite tactic was to deploy in loosely in units of 2 men. One man fired whilst the other reloaded, and this way their force would keep up a constant fire. Exquemelin said that their fusillades never ended. Instead of standing out in the open, they would use cover whenever possible, and even use the smoke of their firearms to conceal advances. If they lacked cover, they would duck, or even lie down when the enemy fired. Eventually, the Spanish learned to aim low. The Spaniards made an attempt to adapt buccaneer tactics, but they either lacked the equipment or their troops lacked the discipline and training to operate as independently as the individual buccaneer could. Their infantry would fight in line formations, and the soldiers might be given coca leaves to stuff in their cheeks. This would give them energy and keep their hunger away. Their biggest battlefield asset would be their cavalry, who could move in from the flanks and cut down the spread-out buccaneers. When the English invaded Santo Domingo in 1655, Spanish cavalry armed only with lances inflicted heavy casualties on the scattered redcoats. To counter cavalry, the buccaneers would either flee into a nearby forest or shoot the horses. The buccaneers could even capture horses and use them to pursue fleeing enemies, but there would rarely be enough horses or skilled riders to use them as an effective buccaneer cavalry. The Spaniards would also improvise and make use of an orthodox tactic. At Panama, they drove a herd of cattle to trample the buccaneers. The buccaneers shot down the herders, causing the stampede to turn around and trample the Spaniards instead. In Mexico, the Spanish burned a field of dry grass. This didn't stop the buccaneers' advance. In the South Seas, they used poisoned bullets, for which the buccaneers chastised them heavily. Whilst the buccaneers preferred to fight in an irregular fashion of teams of 2, they could deploy in organized formations. Their flintlocks enabled them to stand in close lines and give more accurate volleys than matchlock gun lines. At Panama, Morgan deployed his inexperienced militiamen and volunteers in a line formation, whilst his veteran buccaneers supported them irregularly from the flanks. To counter cavalry charges, buccaneers deployed in semicircular formations, not dissimilar from the square formations used on the Napoleonic battlefields over 100 years later. If a company sustained a lot of damage, they could put their wounded in the center of a circular formation and retreat backwards. The circle of shooters would allow them to fend off any incoming attackers, cavalry in particular. If the wounded could still walk, they might assist the shooters by reloading their firearms or passing them around. Buccaneers didn't have the time or patience to besiege the defenders until they started out. They always launched head-on assaults. Before we discuss how they assaulted, we need to take a look at the various fortifications used by the Spaniards. The best fortifications were forts or castles built with thick walls from stone and mortar. Rover ships carried weak cannon that could scarcely penetrate a proper ship, let alone do any damage to stone walls. In media like Pirates of the Caribbean or Assassin's Creed, we see pirates bombarding forts from the sea, but this only really happened once, at the sack of Cartagena in 1697. But pirates weren't the ones doing the bombardment, it was the French Navy, who had recruited buccaneers to bolster their numbers. Castle walls were lined with crenellations and heavy bronze cannon that could sink attacking ships. Some forts had small towers, others had bastions, curved or angular consoles projecting out from the main wall. Forts were often surrounded by ditches, which might be 6 foot deep or even 30. The only entryway over a ditch would be a drawbridge, and the Spanish coat of arms was always fixed over the fort gates. Forts were placed at strategic locations or surrounding a city, often in close proximity to each other. Many cities also had proper stone walls. Wooden walls filled with earth were said to be as good as stone, and wooden castles were a common enough sight. Barbed wire did not exist in the 1600s, but some Caribbean towns were fortified with thorny bushes. Esquemlin described one such barricade. The rest of the town round about was planted with certain shrubs or trees named raquelets, very full of thorns and these very sharp-pointed. The buccaneers were unable to break through this shrubbery, making them a very effective defense. Lionel Wayford described the Darien natives as using similar fortifications, consisting of cactuses and prickly pear. However, most cities and towns were only defended by wooden palisades, stockades or barricades. Palisades are tall, upright poles. Stockades are vertical logs. Buccaneers could easily pull these down or scale them. In a pinch, the Spanish would hastily erect crude fortifications like trenches, batteries, barricades, and breastworks. Breastworks were built from dirt or sacks of sand and clay. They reached up to the shooter's breast, giving cover against enemy fire. When buccaneers attacked a fortification, the first step was to take cover and lay down suppressive fire on the walls. This created a curtain of smoke, allowing for a group of men to advance closer and throw in grenades. The buccaneers' articles rewarded them for every grenade they shucked. They used axes to cut down doors, gates, and barricades, and if the walls were too strong, they would scale with ladders wide enough for 3 men to climb at once. At close range, they used pistols, grenades, and cutlashes. Grenades called stink pots created a noxious gas that could smoke defenders out from their rooms. The first man to breach the enemy was awarded with 20 pounds sterling. After seizing the walls, the buccaneers took to the streets. There was no space to skirmish, so they advanced and fired in volleys. Most of the garrison would be routed at this point, but remaining defenders would lie down on the roofs and shoot at the attackers. The best way to subdue them was the use of threats. If they didn't surrender the city, the buccaneers would burn it to the ground. What would the Spanish do when they lost? The civilians would flee in advance, taking with them their valuables loaded on muleback. The governor, officials, and religious figures might escape by boat. The treasures of the churches would be loaded on ship and carried off until it was safe to return. Meanwhile, the victorious buccaneers located the biggest church in town. Here they held mass and sang their praises to God. They would use the church as their corps de garde and a hospital to treat their wounded. In the cellar they would find torture devices like the rack, used by the Inquisition on troublesome citizenry. These the buccaneers would put to good use in squeezing information from prisoners, where the refugees went or where they kept their money. Expeditions were sent out to catch the refugees, loot the countryside, and the ships that had fled with treasure. Hostages and prisoners would be extorted, and cooperation was demanded. During the 1697 sack of Cartagena, the French rewarded any resident who informed them of neighbors hiding their valuables. Slaves were either left alone or taken as plunder, exchanging one cruel master for another. But if the slaves had helped the buccaneers in taking the city, they would be freed and protected. The male citizens would be used as servants, left to their own or confined. Same for the women. Many women prostituted themselves to the occupiers, willingly and unwillingly. A few did it for pleasure, whilst most did it to get better food and conditions. As for rape, it seems to have been less common than we're led to believe. Reports of rape were surprisingly scarce, and there wasn't really any stigma towards rape victims during the 1600s, so there was no shame in reporting it. It should, however, be noted that rape against slaves was never recorded. The occupation would only last as long as necessary. A larger force would be able to occupy the city for a spell, whilst a smaller one had to loot and vanish. The most effective way was to ransom the town in return for not burning it. The Spanish might attempt to delay the ransom until a relief force could arrive. In that case, the buccaneers would have to mount a defense or an ambuscade. Whilst the citizenry fled with their valuables, they would leave their pantries alone, allowing the buccaneers to gorge themselves on food and wine. They would often find sweetmeats that were popular with Spanish ladies. Chocolate and sugar were everyday commodities that could be looted and sold, but pirates loved a cup of hot chocolate. Cattle would be slaughtered, roasted, and eaten. It was common for buccaneers to take the ransom in beeves that could then be barbecued into sea rations for future voyages. Spices such as allspice or pepper were popular loot. Inedible goods included dyes like cochineal, cloth, and silk. You had both local produce from the plantations and mines, and other goods imported from Spanish colonies as far as the Philippines. There were the aforementioned treasures from the churches and hard cash, of course. Spanish coinage was the de facto currency of buccaneer havens like Port Royal, even after the Golden Age. Mining towns were popular targets for buccaneers. In Panama you'd find gold mines, and some buccaneers and privateers crossed into the South Seas to strike at the silver towns. When the ransom had been paid or enough loot amassed, the buccaneers returned home and went on another raid. If the ransom wasn't paid, the city might be burned to the ground. Rover attacks on cities were very profitable. Henry Morgan's attack on Portobello amassed a fortune worth 7 times the annual sugar income of Jamaica. So why did pirates stop attacking cities? For one, the Spaniards invested more resources in improving their colonial defenses. They rebuilt fortifications, issued new equipment and training for the militias, and reinforced the Caribbean with a pirate-hunting fleet, the Armada de Barlavento. They employed privateers known as Guardacosta, who launched preemptive strikes on buccaneer havens like New Providence and Petit-Goât, similarly to how the English and French governors had used the buccaneers. With the use of superior numbers and competent commanders, the Spaniards demonstrated that the once unstoppable buccaneers could be defeated. The old generation of veteran soldiers and hunters died out, and the expertise they left behind faded away. Sea rovers found it increasingly preferable to operate in small ships and cruise and prey on weakly armed merchants that surrendered instantly. The pirates of the 1710s were of this kind. Take Blackbeard's blockade of Charleston, for example. Why didn't he just sail in guns blazing and ransack the port? His crew of 300 had scarcely seen a fight and would go up against scouts, veterans, and rangers that had fought against the Spaniards and Indians during the recent war. These hard asses would send Blackbeard's boys on the run. That's not to say that pirates after the buccaneers didn't fight on land sometimes. Henry Jennings marched on the Spanish salvage camp with musketeers, drums, and banners. Pirates like Levasseur and Davis attacked small forts and factories across Africa, and that's about it. The historian Ben Russell put it simply, that the pirates of the late Golden Age sacked few land targets, and none of any significance. Let's take a look at a comment from last week. Big Cuss asked why the forts found in the Caribbean were shaped like stars. Basically, European forts at the time were built to resist cannon barrages. It's harder to bombard a star-shaped fortification than just a flat, straight wall. The star shape and various consoles also created funnels for besieging troops which the defenders could shoot from. I hope you enjoyed the history of Spanish fortifications in this video, Cuss. Huge thanks to my generous supporters on Patreon: Cole Freer, Max Dweck, RideRadio88, and Michael Jantz. If you want to support me monetarily, you'll find links in the description to PayPal and Patreon. If you can't, that's fine. Please give the video a like and leave a comment on the video. Even just a shitpost will help the algorithm spread my content. Why don't you tell me something you enjoyed especially in the video, or if something was unclear? Cheers.